91-year-old veteran gets harassed by 5 bikers. One phone call changes everything at 91 years old. Frank Peterson had seen more in his lifetime than most could imagine. A decorated war veteran, he had served his country with honor and survived battles that had claimed many of his brothers in arms. Despite his age, Frank remained independent, living in a small town in Montana where everyone knew him, or so he thought. One afternoon, Frank decided to stop at a roadside diner for lunch. It was the kind of place he had visited for decades, a quaint little spot with old-fashioned bar stools, checkered tablecloths, and the smell of fresh coffee in the air. As he stepped inside, he nodded at the waitress behind the counter, who greeted him with a warm smile. But just as Frank was settling into his seat, the door swung open with a loud bang. 5 burly bikers strode in, their leather jackets adorned with patches, their boots stomping against the tile floor. Their laughter was loud and crude, filling the diner with an air of arrogance. Frank didn't pay them much attention at first. He had dealt with rough men before, far worse than these. But soon, he realized that they had set their sights on him. "Hey, old man," one of them sneered, walking up to Frank's table. "Shouldn't you be in a retirement home, sipping soup?" The others laughed as another biker grabbed Frank's hat right off his head and tossed it to his friend. "Give that back," Frank said calmly, his voice firm but unwavering. "Or what?" the first biker taunted. "You gonna call the nursing home police?" Frank sighed. He knew men like these, bullies who thrived on intimidation. The other diners looked on in silence, too afraid to intervene. But Frank had faced men with far more power and cruelty in his past. And he had learned long ago that strength didn't always come from muscles. It came from experience, from knowing when to act and when to wait. So he did something unexpected. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an old flip phone. With slow, deliberate movements, he pressed a single button and held the phone to his ear. "Yeah," he said. "I need some help." The bikers chuckled. "What? You calling the cops?" one of them mocked. Frank didn't answer. He simply closed the phone and set it down on the table. Then he picked up his coffee and took a sip, as though nothing had happened. The bikers were still laughing when the sound of engines filled the air, loud, powerful engines. Not just one, not two, but several. Within moments, the diner's parking lot was filled with motorcycles. And these weren't just any riders. A dozen men, all wearing matching leather jackets with a distinct insignia, climbed off their bikes and marched toward the diner. These weren't just any bikers. They were members of a well-known, highly respected veteran motorcycle club. The leader, a tall man with a thick gray beard and piercing eyes, pushed the diner door open and scanned the room. His gaze landed on Frank, then shifted to the 5 bikers. "You boys bothering Mr. Peterson?" he asked in a low, gravelly voice. The bikers, who had been so cocky moments ago, suddenly looked uneasy. "Hey man," one of them stammered. "We were just joking around." "Didn't look like a joke to me," the bearded man replied. "You see, Frank here, he's family to us." The color drained from the bikers' faces. They had picked on the wrong man. Frank wasn't just a veteran. He was a legend in the veteran community, a man who had fought for his country and earned the unwavering loyalty of those who had served after him. The bearded man took a step closer. "I suggest you apologize," he said, "and then you leave." The 5 bikers didn't need to be told twice. They mumbled apologies, quickly placed a few crumpled bills on the table to pay for Frank's meal, and hurried out the door. Their own bikes roared to life as they sped out of the parking lot, eager to escape. The bearded man turned to Frank and grinned. "Sorry we're late, old man. You know we always got your back." Frank chuckled, shaking his head. Didn't doubt it for a second. The other veterans sat down with Frank, and the waitress, who had been holding her breath, finally smiled and brought over a fresh pot of coffee. The lesson was clear. Some men fight their battles alone, but the truly wise ones know that real strength comes from the bonds they share with those who stand by them. And Frank? He was never alone. The diner slowly returned to normal after the 5 bikers sped away, their tails tucked between their legs. Frank leaned back in his chair, enjoying the hot coffee as his fellow veterans surrounded him. The bearded leader, known as Big Jack, sat across from him with a knowing smirk. "You really had them shaking in their boots, old man," Jack chuckled, stirring his coffee. Frank smirked. "Didn't even have to lift a finger?" The other veterans laughed, the camaraderie between them as strong as ever. They had all served at different times, in different wars, but there was a bond among them that nothing could break. To them, Frank wasn't just an old-timer. He was a legend, a man who had seen the worst of war and still carried himself with dignity. But as the laughter died down, a younger member of the club, a man named Riley, spoke up. "Jack," he said, his voice serious, "those bikers weren't just some random thugs. I recognize their patches. They're part of the Black Vultures." A hush fell over the table. The Black Vultures were a notorious outlaw motorcycle gang that ran extortion and illegal business in the surrounding areas. They weren't just a group of punks looking for trouble, they were dangerous. Frank took another sip of his coffee, unfazed. "They'll come back," Riley added. "And next time, they might not just be looking to scare people." Jack leaned forward, his eyes locked onto Frank's. "You worried?" Frank set his cup down and looked around the table at the men he trusted. Then he gave a slow, confident shake of his head. Not even a little. The retaliation 2 days passed without incident. But Frank had lived long enough to know that trouble wasn't gone. It was just waiting for the right moment. Sure enough, one evening as Frank sat on his porch enjoying the Montana sunset, he heard the distant rumble of motorcycles. Not just one or two, many. A slow smile crept onto his face. "They sure took their sweet time," he muttered. The Black Vultures rolled up in a pack of nearly 20, their bikes growling like wild beasts. Their leader, a thick, tattooed man with a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward as the others parked their bikes in Frank's driveway. "Old man," the leader called out, his voice laced with menace. "You made my boys look like fools the other day." Frank stood up slowly, his old bones creaking slightly. "They did that on their own," he replied calmly. The bikers chuckled darkly. "You think this is funny?" the leader sneered. "We don't like being disrespected, and we sure as hell don't like old war heroes thinking they still run the show." Frank sighed, then reached into his pocket. "Oh, you're making a call again?" the leader mocked. "Who you calling this time?" "The nursing home." Frank smirked. "Nah," he said, flipping open the phone. "Just calling in a favor." Before the bikers could react, the sound of motorcycles filled the air, louder, stronger. From the hills, from the road, from all directions, headlights pierced the growing darkness. Within moments, more than 30 riders descended upon Frank's property, surrounding the Black Vultures completely. These weren't just any bikers. These were military veterans, men trained in combat, men who had fought real wars. And they were ready. Big Jack stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. "You boys got about 10 seconds to turn around and get lost," he said. The leader of the Black Vultures hesitated, glancing around at the sea of veterans. They weren't scared kids. They weren't barroom brawlers. These were men who had seen true violence, men who didn't back down from a fight. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, with a scowl, the leader spat on the ground and nodded. "Let's go," he muttered. One by one, the Black Vultures mounted their bikes and rode off into the night. Frank let out a breath, his smile never fading. He turned to Jack. "You sure took your sweet time," he said. Jack laughed. "Had to make sure they felt real surrounded." Frank chuckled and patted his friend on the back. "Next time, tell him to bring more guys. Maybe then it'd be a fair fight." The veterans laughed, and as the sound of their bikes echoed into the night, Frank sat back down in his rocking chair, knowing he was exactly where he belonged, among brothers who always had his back. The Black Vultures had retreated into the night, but Frank knew men like that never gave up so easily. They were humiliated, their pride wounded, and wounded men were dangerous. As the last of the veteran bikers lingered outside Frank's home, Big Jack pulled up a chair next to him on the porch. The night was quiet now, but there was an unspoken understanding between them. This wasn't over. "We sent them running," Jack said, lighting a cigar. "But they'll be back." Frank nodded, gazing out at the moonlit fields. "I know." Jack took a slow puff. "So what's the plan, old man?" Frank smirked. "We finished this." The final battle the next morning, Frank made a few calls, not to his biker brothers this time, but to some old military friends who still had connections. He asked for one favor, one simple thing. Within hours, word spread across the town, and soon, it reached the Black Vultures. That evening, the gang rolled into town, their bikes roaring like thunder. This time, they weren't just here to intimidate, they were here for war. They pulled up outside Frank's diner, expecting to find him alone, expecting easy revenge. Instead, they found something else entirely. Lined up in front of the diner were not just the veteran bikers, but active-duty military personnel. Soldiers from the nearby base, men and women in uniform, stood tall and unyielding. Among them were local law enforcement, state troopers, and even a few federal agents who had taken an interest in the vulture's illegal activities. Frank stepped forward, hands in his pockets, his eyes locked onto the vulture's leader. "You boys came back," he said. "That was a mistake." The leader clenched his jaw, trying to keep his composure. "You think a bunch of soldiers and cops scare us?" Frank chuckled. "No, but a full-scale investigation into your drug operations might." The color drained from the leader's face. "You've been making a mess in this town for too long," Frank continued. "And my friends here? They don't take kindly to criminals." At that moment, unmarked black SUVs rolled up, and men in suits stepped out. FBI. One of the agents, a sharp-eyed woman with a confident stride, pulled out a file and handed it to the leader. "Your club's been on our radar for a while," she said. "Weapons trafficking, drug distribution, extortion. But thanks to some new evidence, we finally have what we need." She smirked and gestured toward Frank. "Courtesy of Mr. Peterson." The leader's hands clenched into fists. He had underestimated the old man. "Now," the agent continued, "you have two choices: get on your bikes and leave town forever, or come with us in cuffs." The vultures hesitated. Then, one by one, they turned to their bikes, revved their engines, and peeled out of town. They knew they had lost. They knew they would never come back. As the dust settled, the agent turned to Frank. "You ever consider working for us, Mr. Peterson?" she joked. Frank chuckled. "I did my time. Besides, handling punks like that is just a hobby." Big Jack clapped him on the shoulder. "You're a damn legend, Frank." Frank smiled as he picked up his coffee from the diner counter. He took a slow sip, savoring the moment. "Just an old man with good friends," he said. And with that, life in the little town returned to normal, knowing that as long as Frank Peterson was around, no trouble would ever last for long.